So today we're going to look at Ronald Reagan and his foreign policy. When Reagan takes office, we are in the midst of heightened tensions with the Soviet Union. The Cold War has, reheated from the détente of the 70s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The United States and Soviet relations were at a more tense point than they had been prior to Reagan's administration and Carter's administration. Uh, in the early 80s, Reagan doubles defense spending, as we talked about when it came to the Reagan economy and the deficits that were created. A lot of it has to do with the fact that there's a major increase in defense spending. Reagan significantly increases a lot of different aspects of that. One of the other things that Reagan does, and it gets a lot of criticism, but it's something that, as we've looked back, is a big part of why we were able to get such good deals with the Soviet Union eventually, and begin to bring an end to the Cold War. And that was with an idea called SDI, and SDI stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. This was also dubbed by the media as Star Wars because it seemed like it was science fiction. The whole premise and idea behind SDI was it was an anti-missile system designed to shoot nuclear missiles from space before they entered Earth. Now, Reagan goes on TV. He's got these cool graphics that he's showing, explaining how he's calling on the scientific community to develop these type of weapons that will help kind of make nuclear weapons obsolete. Reagan's actual plan was that if we ever perfected this, that we would actually give it to the Soviet Union. The idea being if we couldn't use nuclear missiles on them and they couldn't use nuclear missiles on us, that this would eliminate the threat of nuclear war between the two sides. We never get to this point. We're still researching things like this, but we're not at the point where this type of thing is some foolproof method where it will work. But there's an importance to SDI and just the beginning of this research in terms of dealing with the Soviets that's important to understand. The big issue, though, is it costs a lot of money. And as a result of that, it's called Star Wars. It seems like science fiction, and people are very critical of this. Some people even be critical of it today, but a lot of that is because they don't really understand the biggest impact that the program had. Now, one of the things Reagan does is he changes the language of the Cold War. So many people were, and leaders, it was always, treat the Soviet Union with kid gloves, don't say anything too harsh to them, don't do things of that nature. But that's not Reagan. Reagan hates communism, absolutely detests it, speaks out against it his entire life, calls it out for what it is, the limits of freedom that it put on the individual, and the power it gave, the full force of central government, and the absolute failure of that full fat power of central government. Reagan was always quick to point out, and rightfully so. In one of his most famous speeches, he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And Reagan was very good at calling out communism for exactly what it was. Essentially, Reagan would, he'd tell the truth about it and say things that couldn't be, undermined in any way. So Reagan's whole purpose, the whole purpose of his spending is to start pressuring the Soviets. Reagan realizes early on in his presidency that there is a window, there's an opportunity essentially to really get at the Soviets and start getting us on a path to ending the Cold War. Now, when Reagan takes office, keep in mind, there were definitely signs that the Soviets were heading towards towards decline. In fact, Reagan said that, even before he spoke, as he was president and campaigning, that communism was something that he believed was in its final chapters and something for the dust heap of history. And he was proven correct on that. There's a lot of signs, though. Alcoholism goes way up in the Soviet Union. Mortality rates go down. People aren't living as long in the Soviet Union, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of the internal problems from malnutrition and things of that nature. Abortions go way up. People don't want to bring children into the communist world because of how little prosperity there is in it. So Reagan sees this opportunity. He's just, they make the decision. Let's ramp up defense spending. Let's pressure the Soviets. He knew in the end they wouldn't be able to keep up with us, and they never cut their budget. The Soviets never cut their defense budget. They try to keep up with the United States. They don't really have the opportunity to do that. Now, the evil empire speech. This is the text of it. Let us pray that for the salvation of all those who live in that totalitarian darkness. Pray they will discover the joy of knowing God, but until they do, let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all people on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. He would, speak not like no other president had about the Soviet Union and about communism. He, by referring to them for what he saw them as, it was a lot different than what a lot of other presidents had done, and that change in language was important. I mean, he was, he really makes the argument that we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, that we point our guns out towards our enemies, in towards their own people. So what eventually winds up happening, guys, is as Reagan takes office, people are saying, get critical of him by, his first term, by towards the end of his first term in office, because he hasn't had any summits. He hasn't really been able to meet with any Soviet leaders. But the problem is, and as Reagan would point out, they all kept dying on him. When Reagan takes over in 1981, the leader of the Soviet Union is a guy named Brezhnev. In 1982, Brezhnev dies, and Yuri Andropov takes over. Andropov is in power from 82 to 84. He dies in office, and then another leader named Chernenko comes in. He serves from 84 to 85, and then he dies in office. So literally in Reagan's first 5 years in office, 3 Soviet leaders die. In his first, as his first term comes to an end, before his first term comes to an end, he's on his 3rd leader, and then shortly into his 2nd term, he's on his 4th Soviet leader. But the 4th one and the last one is important, and that's Mikhail Gorbachev. He becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is very much a moderate. This is something, and this is where a lot of people, talk about where with Reagan, they kept thinking that if you speak too harsh, they're going to put in somebody harsh. That's why, kind of presidents always treated things carefully. They were hoping to get somebody more moderate, more kind of with kid gloves. We treated the Soviet Union. We would just get a Soviet hardline leader after Soviet hardline leader after Soviet hardline leader. But Reagan, with his tough talk, eventually gets us to Gorbachev. And Gorbachev is a much more moderate Soviet leader when it comes to communism. Much more than those before. He actually, rises in power as a result of his ability to do well. He was head of agriculture, and actually one of the things Gorbachev does is he gives the farmers a little more freedom to grow what they want, and lo and behold, production goes up. So Gorbachev is very different, but he's still holding on to a lot of the communist principles that they have. But they meet in Geneva to just kind of feel each other out, and then they meet in Reykjavik, Iceland, to discuss nuclear missiles, to come up with a nuclear agreement. And this is where we see the brilliance of Ronald Reagan, especially as a negotiator. What winds up happening is they are so close. Reagan, as tough as he would talk, he really dreamed of a world free of nuclear weapons. He hoped to get there. And Reagan and Gorbachev, they're at this meeting and they're discussing different things. And they take a break eventually and they come back. And Gorbachev starts saying, "Let's get rid of these nuclear weapons. Let's get rid of these nuclear weapons." I mean, he is giving Reagan every single thing Reagan wants. And Reagan, yes. And there's suddenly the buzz gets out there in the air in the media that a historic type of agreement is about to be made between the United States and the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev lifts off. We'll do this. We'll get rid of this. We'll get rid of that. And yes, I agree. And then Gorbachev says, "And you've got to give us SDI." And Reagan slammed his hand on the table, was very upset, and got mad. And Reagan, it wasn't like Reagan to get mad, and Reagan got mad and said no. And they parted with nothing. But eventually what winds up happening is the Soviets come back to the table. Now Reagan comes home and he's got to explain to the American people why they didn't get an agreement there. And he says, they asked for SDI. And he says SDI is what brought them to the table. By Reagan putting this out there, that's what got the Soviets to come and negotiate for a nuclear agreement. And Reagan was not going to give up the very thing that brought them to the table. And Gorbachev goes back home And eventually they realize, like, there becomes a big worry. Well, what if the U.S. does do it? There was this, they have transcripts of these conversations, and the leaders are sitting there going, there's no way they're going to do this. They're decades away from something like this. And then they're sitting there going, this is the country that, built the atomic bomb before anybody else. This is the country that went to the moon before anybody else. What evidence do we have that they would fail at something that they put their minds to? And this brings them back to the table once again. And Gorbachev comes to the United States and they sign a nuclear agreement to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons, of nuclear missiles. And this was an agreement that actually stuck, not like some of the Dayton agreements that were, didn't really stick like they should have. In 1989, Gorbachev, as leader of the Soviet Union, he removes troops from the borders, from the satellite nations, encourages countries to go their own way, says if you don't want communism, the Soviets are not going to bring their forces in anymore. And like dominoes, the communist bloc of countries begins to fall. In November of '89, the Berlin Wall is torn down by the people of East and West Germany together in East and West Berlin. And all other communist nations in Europe, they begin to remove their communist leadership. The fall of communism in the world was not like anyone had thought it would be. Where the fall of communism would thought to have had happened as a result of a massive type of war, a thermonuclear exchange followed by a devastating war, doesn't happen. And the Soviet Union eventually goes down in 1991. But many of those other countries begin to fall before that, without a shot fired. I mean, some bloodshed in terms of taking out leaders that were bad, but no armies clashing, no high death tolls or anything like that. Just an absolute peaceful end of power for the communist countries, and they went on to the dust heap of history, just as Reagan had predicted. All right, and that's an important distinction, that this was all done without any bloodshed. A lot of people credit Reagan with the collapse of communism. There's a lot of people that get credit. Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, who was another one of the great leaders of British history. She, along with Reagan, along with Pope John Paul, along with Polish leaders, all of these play a part. But Reagan is really, somebody that gets an enormous amount of credit, and deservedly so, for the end of the Cold War, for the fall of communism. Critics will argue that the system was ready to collapse and that Reagan's policies didn't matter, that it was going to be there no matter what. But that, again, that's something that in 1981, there were a lot of people that felt like the communist world was just something we were going to have to live with. And, there were the better red than dead and things of that nature is what how some people felt. But it all comes crashing down a year after Reagan leaves office, months after Reagan leaves